Hi, everybody. My name is William Trinh, and I am going to be one of your co-lecturers for today's lecture.
I'm Chloe Wolf, and I'll be the other co-lecturer. So let's get started. So first, generally, what to get out of this. First is that it's a focus on general examples that prove the general statement of the resolution true. Independently, this is kind of an odd topic where plans questionably affirm, but questionably also don't, which we'll get to later. Secondly, is that this does not go over every argument because you need to do prep, but this can be a guide to help you with the historical background and broad pictures of strategic arguments. And third is that the topic itself is incredibly vague and has a very odd wording, so having a greater breadth of rehabilitation goes a long way. In terms of the resolution itself, it's resolved the primary objective of the United States criminal justice system ought to be rehabilitation. So now I'll go through some quick definitions. These are all in a doc that I'll send right after I'm done speaking, of just a lot of stuff for the lecture. But firstly is that primary means of chief importance. This is pretty intuitive. Secondly is that rehabilitation means the action of restoring someone to health or normal life through training and therapy. Next is that criminal justice system is a system of law enforcement that is directly involved in apprehending, prosecuting, defending, sentencing, and punishing those who are suspected or convicted of criminal offenses.
So right before we get into the main substantive portion of today's lecture, I just want to go over some couple key things and couple key similarities between this topic and the criminal justice reform topic that was in high school policy a few years ago. So this topic is honestly decently similar to an old policy topic, which means that finding different ground or like finding arguments can be pretty simple because you can hop onto the high school policy wiki and find these arguments. But the issue with like this topic, like the CGR topic from a few years back, is that the resolution, as like stated by Chloe before, probably and might preclude plans because the way the topic is worded means that there is no resolutional mechanism or resolutional agent that actually acts upon anything. If anything, this resolution is more of a value statement, which means that like arguments that you would normally include into a plan text or advantage areas might just have to become advantage areas. Singular examples of like rehabilitation being good, for example, drug offenses or things like recidivism, should become advantage areas instead of just becoming whole entire plan text. Another key thing on this topic is that picks probably do not negate on this topic for a couple key things. So, because of how the topic is worded and how it's worded as primary objective, picking out of a generic statement or picking out of a general statement probably does not negate, which means that like in instances of like murder, for example, or other instances of high felonies, it's probably not the case that like these singular examples are enough to disprove a generic statement about how criminal justice ought to operate and how rehabilitation should be prioritized in the vast majority of instances, which means that negative arguments should stray away from like these far off examples and should focus instead more about generic examples about how retribution is generically a better system of criminal justice over things like rehabilitation, or approach the topic in a different manner, which will be discussed below. So if you're debating on a philosophical or policy ground this topic, you are probably debating over rehabilitation versus retribution. This is a long-standing debate that has existed within the United States for the longest time. There's a broad debate between these two different models of criminal justice. First is rehabilitation, as discussed above by Chloe, is modeled after this idea of like post-integration for people who have been convicted by the criminal justice system and have an idea of like how to be reintegrated back into society post-punishment and post-incarceration. Whereas retribution is more and modeled after the idea that punishment should be punitive and should protect the rights and interests of victims rather than like the rights and interests of those who have been convicted. So first, let's go over some common 1ECs that you might see in either lay or progressive fields this topic.
Okay, so the first one is the polls AF. For some reason, it wasn't letting me send it in the file share or whatever, so I'll send that after. But in terms of polls, I'll just explain the frameworks at first, and then I'll explain the offense. It's a relatively simple and intuitive framework, and it sounds more complex than it should be explained. But sort of the spin that you would give is basically that that people in the nation should get to choose policies because it's constitutive of the government that it is of the people, especially in a place like the United States, which is a democracy. I'll also go through the individual framework warrants now. The value criterion is consistency with omniperspectivism, which in simpler terms means that we should just take everyone's opinion into account and decide based off of that. And the way that we would do this is through polls. We can also make arguments about how it's the way that democracy intrinsically works as well. And the good thing about this framework is that it's good for both lay and circuit rounds. So the explanation can be used in both types of rounds. The next framework warrant is the relativity problem, which just says that we can only witness things through our own eyes. So we need to aggregate. And again, we would do this through polls. I'll also go through some of the warrants for why polls is a better method of aggregation than utilitarianism is after I explain the individual polls warrants. The Polsner and rights evidence, which you'll see in the doc when it gets sent, is that basically it says that polls are a good method to determine ethics and then gives a poll that agrees. This evidence is good and key because it doesn't make sense to read a polls framework absent backing it up with a poll itself, because then the framework would be kind of nonsensical. The next warrants that I'll go through are likely better for circuit rounds, but can also probably be used with experienced lay judges as well, although I'd recommend changing the wording a little bit. The next argument is an argument that says that the only way to fairly reconcile a bunch of opposing ethical disagreements and viewpoints is through polls. Next is performativity, which is an argument more about debate itself, which means that it can a little bit come on a higher layer than all the other arguments. For example, speaking concedes the authority of omniperspectivism, since words only have meaning if the majority of people in society use them in the way that they're expected. The next warrant, which is interpretive regress, essentially also means the same thing. We can only interpret words and phrases a certain way because the majority of society agrees on it. Actor specificity means that it's the way that the government does things, i.e., through democracy and voting, the government intrinsically relies on polls. Then the next thing in the document is the ought definition, which means opinion. It's not super necessary. It's just mainly good if someone makes an argument that polls are not technically intrinsically binding or ethical. You can make the argument that ought just means of one's own opinion. Next, in terms of offense, there's two offense cards. Polls does not negate on this topic really at all, so I would not have to worry about a straight ref or any sort of counter offense, but you should mainly worry about refuting other frameworks that come up as opposed to thinking about the contention level offense section. Although I did cut 2 pieces of contention level offense just to be safe. And as a side note, in all rounds that are reliant on framework debates, you should be making arguments about epistemic confidence and that their offense does not weigh under your framework, and whoever wins the framework debate should win the round. If you're confused about epistemic confidence, you can ask more questions about this at the end. I'm not going to go too much into it now, but now I'll just go through the individual evidence. The Blizzard 18 evidence says that people prefer rehabilitation over punishment. It's pretty simple in the way that it lays it out. The second piece essentially says the same thing, but much more in-depth and lays out the research methodologies that it goes through. And if you're planning on reading polls, I'd recommend reading the second card pretty in-depth so that you can have a very robust defense of your specific polls that you have, which likely won't be contested, but it's good to have anyway.
All right. The second thing we will be going over today will be for one of these will be policy affirmatives and different policy arguments that you can either run in traditional or slightly more progressive settings. So let's be honest, I'm not going to lie on this topic. This topic is pretty terrible for policy ground, especially if you're a util debater or if you're somebody who likes existential risk calculus, namely because of the resolutional wording, and mainly because this is a criminal justice topic that should probably not have existential risk calculus or risk impacts. So because of the resolutional wording, there lacks an actual agent or actor within the resolution, which means that like it's questionable about how you can specify how we ought to prioritize things like rehabilitation over other alternative models of criminal justice, which means that like specific examples should not be like individual plain text as discussed above. They should be turned into individual advantage areas or contention arguments that you can make that help you prove like that the whole resolution as a generic statement or a general statement is generally true as a broad general principle. This will be particularly important on the March-April topic because a lot of states that debate the March-April topic are taken away from the national circuit and are often situated in many traditional states like in the Midwest, for example, or states in like the East Coast or even California will use this topic and are often situated in like models of debate and like forms of debate that are hostile to apps that abandon the resolution and are hostile to affirmatives that like don't defend generic examples and instead debate things like plans, for example. Like in California, absent the national circuit, plans planned debate is something that is banned at the state tournament, which means that you are by definition forced to like defend the whole resolution as a general principle and as a general statement. So now we will go over these individual cases, but as a precursor, these cases will all presume that you're running your run-up-the-mill structural violence 1AC or some other consequentialist soft law style 1AC frameworks that might be things like maximizing expected well-being, your util frameworks, or like some other version of soft left that like framework that says prioritize structural consequences and prioritize those structural impacts above other impacts. Things like that, which are pretty run up the mill and pretty self-explanatory. But if anybody has any questions about like how you might want to leverage a structural balance framework at the end of the lecture, feel free to ask me or Chloe, and we'd be happy to answer. So first, now on the actual policy ground on this topic. The first policy ground I actually really like about this topic could be drug arrest and decriminalization as a methodology to do things like rehabilitation. I think this can be really cool soft left ground for like a bunch of different reasons. One is the uniqueness behind this. One is that drug policy has been an issue and been a common debate topic, not in like high school policy debate or high school LD, but like as an actual like debate topic within the halls of Congress and within state legislatures about how to deal with the higher crime rates and higher like usages of drugs, whether it's things like education, rehabilitation, mandatory minimums against dealers, against even users or people who even possess drugs, etc. Which means that like there's plenty of literature based about how and like there's also discussion about how drug use should be treated as a rehabilitative issue over like an issue because it's like viewed as a victimless crime, which means that like there's plenty of literature base when it comes to like these specific advantage grounds. So the uniqueness for this is that drug arrests, despite the fact that we are living in a world where like marijuana is becoming more and more like legalized across the entirety of the United States, and where the federal government doesn't actually prosecute marijuana drug violations, other drug arrests writ large have actually been rising within the past couple of years, and as a result, people have been locked up and put in and are more likely to be in contact with the prison industrial complex and the prison industrial system for like the last few years because of things like drug arrests. So that is like uniqueness for like your scenario, that right now there's like an issue with like drug violations, and that the current system is like unable to like either reduce drug violations or is like punitively like punishing people and putting them into prisons. The link that you might want to establish for decriminalization or forced rehabilitation should be one about what decriminalization entails. So decriminalization is not the exact same thing as legalization. Decriminalization just basically says that like you would remove all criminal and punitive punishments and punitive violations as a result of doing something. Like, let's say like you live in a state where marijuana is decriminalized. That does not mean it is legal to buy or purchase or sell marijuana or to consume it. You can still like face penalties for like possessing marijuana. The difference is that you cannot be actually thrown into jail for using marijuana, and you can't be thrown into and like yeah, also, quick thing in the chat, all evidence that is being referenced is also all going to be published. First, on the Discord, there will be a live document that is published with all evidence. And secondly, is that we will also send a Word doc and PDF to every single person who was in the meeting today with all relevant evidence. For some reason, the evidence is not going to be uploaded into the meeting chat, so all evidence that is being referenced will be sent to y'all eventually. So quick thing right now is that decriminalization is that you can still like enact like, for example, penalties with decriminalization. They just can't be criminal or punitive in nature. Like you can like take away like you can like, let's say like with marijuana, you don't have to like put somebody in prison for marijuana, or like but like you can still fine somebody for like possessing marijuana, or you can like still force them to like enter some program, like rehabilitation programs when it comes to marijuana. The idea is that you can argue that like an example of rehabilitation that could be effective and that should be prioritized would be forced drug rehabilitation. There is extensive evidence in online from like credible government sources like the CDC that talks about how forced drug rehabilitation can lower things like drug usage, and as a result lower prison populations, because it diverts a large portion of people who would otherwise go to prison because of minor drug violations into these diversionary programs that instead work to prevent them from having drug violations in the future, but also prevent them from going into prison right away. And the impact of this, especially if you're running a soft left structuralist affirmative could be things like you can impact out that lower drug rates are like a good thing because people who commit drugs are more likely to either commit future crimes or more likely to live unproductive lives that are like more harmful to them and the rest of society. And you can argue that lowering drug rates is something that is intrinsic good. But you can also take a more leftist spin on this and talk about how like there is like inherent racism that comes from the arrests of that comes from like higher drug arrests and comes from the lockup and comes from the lockups of people and locking up people in prison because of drug violations, and how that is something that is intrinsically racist and something that should be immediately rectified. And I think that is definitely something that can be appealing in many different circumstances, but might not be appealing in some traditional circumstances, especially in like many like richer areas or more like wealthier areas where like drug usage or like where like the idea of like trying to like defend like the idea of victimless crime is something that is like more inadvisable on a strategic standpoint, which means that like you might want to find something that like has like a different or that is more strategic on a late level for like, especially if you're attending NSDA quals with or like state quals or the state tournament within the near future, where you will come into people who like will have like predisposition views against like decriminalization, like forced rehabilitation. The second policy argument that I think is like the core stock affirmative on this topic, if you're affirmative, is recidivism. I think recidivism is something that is a major pressing issue within the United States, especially compared to the rest of the developed world. A major issue in the United States is that the United States has one of the highest, if not the highest recidivism rates in the entire world because of constant pressure from things like has like the highest recidivism rate within the developed world. Because there is a higher recidivism rate right now in the United States than anywhere else in the developed world, there's an argument to be made by activists and scholars alike that like the current system of retribution is not able to actually prevent people from committing more crimes. And a major issue with this is that there is nothing that in the criminal justice system right now in the United States mainly that actually has an incentive to like rehabilitate people or like reintegrate them into the rest of society. Like oftentimes when you're locked up in prison, you're often not given, for example, job guarantees or like job trainings post prison like when you're in prison to like find skills when you're necessary to like find jobs when you necessarily get out of prison. But like also another thing is that like when you're also in prison, when you also get out of prison, there is also a permanent record or like a permanent like blemish on your record that like will always follow you along, which means like employers, like prospective employers and employees are less likely to want to hire you now because you are viewed as somebody who is dangerous and you are viewed as somebody who can't be trusted, which means that like a lot of times when people realize that something on their record, they often commit more crimes as a result of that because they already are unable to find different opportunities, which forces them into recidivism and forces them into committing more crimes. So the way that you should be arguing rehabilitation here is that you could definitely spin this as like a way to like reduce crime in like a lay setting. Like the argument that you should be making is that the 1AC does not make a claim that crime is inherently something that is defensible, but rather that there's an argument to be made that there is a better way to like prevent how crime operates. And the link to this should be that you should cite studies from other countries, like for example, Nordic countries that talk about how rehabilitation writ large is key to bring down recidivism and how they have let's see here. I'll answer some other questions in the chat right now about like criticisms at the end. So like if you have any questions about any other arguments, feel free to like ask them at the end of the lecture and like save them into the end. We will save 20 minutes at the end to like answer any questions. But like the argument that you should be making is that rehabilitation makes these people more likely to be reintegrated into society, and they're more likely to like find jobs as a result and are less likely to turn to crime. This leads to things like less crime in the future, which you can spin as something that is definitely like an intrinsic good in like a lay audience, or you can make arguments about how this leads to more productive citizens, which is key for things like economic growth. If you're trying to like find some key economic growth keywords, if you're trying to like argue like that recidivism is like bad for like unproductive citizens. So like that's another policy argument that you can definitely make when you're affirming on this topic. Next, let's go over some 1NCs. Back to Chloe.
So in terms of 1NCs, one of the first ones that I thought of was Kant. The Kant framework can be pretty complex, but it can also be simplified a lot for lay rounds as well. I'll just go through sort of the syllogism here. It comes down to reason being the basis for ethics, mainly because it's a prerequisite to being considered an ethical agent in the first place. For example, an evil demon deceiving us or the inability to know others' experience makes empiricism an unreliable basis for universal ethics, which means that we're unable to see naturalistic ethics, or we're unable to use naturalistic ethics like utilitarianism because we don't know that everyone experiences the same thing, because there could be something like an evil demon deceiving us or different conceptions of pleasure and pain, etc., which makes naturalistic ethics impossible to follow. Next is the bindingness argument, which is very important for Kant. It says that we intrinsically need reason because it is a prerequisite, which essentially means that it's the only binding metric for ethics. Action theory says that only evaluating action through reason solves, since reason is key to evaluate intent. Otherwise, we could infinitely divide actions, and there'd be no unifying intent to be able to condemn an action as moral or immoral. There's a couple other warrants, but for the sake of simplicity and time, and also because the other warrants are relatively intuitive, I'll skip them and just ask questions at the end if you're confused about the warrants below those. But another one of the most important warrants is universality. Absent universal ethics, morality becomes arbitrary and fails to guide action in all instances, which means that ethics is rendered useless. The next warrant is that by virtue of being universal, it means that it applies to everything, because anything else would be contradictory and justify someone else being able to impede on your ends, which would basically be like saying 2 plus 2 equals 4 for one person, so 2 plus 2 equals 4 for everyone, which means that ethics are able to be universal, whereas some naturalistic ethics are not. Next, another argument, which is really good against arguments like util and consequentialism, consequentialist-based frameworks, is that consequences fail or induction fails. I'll explain some of the most important warrants right now. The first one is the butterfly effect. Basically, actions can have infinite stemming consequences, i.e., for example, one action that you take might lead to a bunch of unintended consequences, like if you sneeze and then it causes a tornado and it kills thousands. Obviously, you didn't intend for that to happen, but it happened anyway, which means that intent should be the thing that that ethics are based off of. Next is that it relies on induction, which inevitably is circular and fails, because if you're using something to justify itself, then that means that you're not actually using something that's intrinsic to those things to justify it, which means that there's no guarantee that future events will be reliant on past events. Next is less an argument for consequences fail and more of an argument for aggregation fails. But intrinsically, it's very illogical to say, oh, like 10 headaches equals 1 migraine or something like that, which means that there's no way to weigh between different conceptions of pleasure and pain, which means that we're not really able to aggregate unless we hook people up to like pain machines or whatever, which is just not a feasible action, and we aren't able to derive ethics from that. Finally, is that you can't condemn actions until they're completed under a consequentialist framework. For example, utilitarianism relies on consequences to be able to determine if an action is good or bad, but we don't know the consequences of an action until after the action happens. Obviously, the resolution has not already happened yet, which would mean that we are not able to predict the consequences and we are not able to condemn it until after it's happened, which means that we're not really going to be able to predict whether or not it's a good action. In terms of the offense, Kant was a retributist, which means that he believed in harsh punishment as opposed to rehabilitation. His philosophy around punishment pretty much mirrors the eye for an eye philosophy relatively closely. It also falls very heavily in line with the categorical imperative. The card that's in the document that has been sent in the EIF server explains more. I'll explain the warrants and read some of them right now. I'll read directly from the card because it puts it very well. The right to punish is the right a ruler has against his subject to inflict pain upon him because of his having committed a crime. The law of punishment is a categorical imperative. Whatever evil you inflict upon another, you inflict upon yourself. If someone committed murder, he must die. Kant also says that punishment shouldn't be used as a means to improve society or to improve the criminal. It should only be used as a form of punishment, which means that we should not take into account the utility of certain punishments, which means that even if it causes a better society for punishment to not be severe, we still shouldn't look to that because it's intrinsically ethical to punish someone the way that someone has wronged someone else.
Next, I want to approach the topic from like an alternative perspective here. So I want to see, so a lot of y'all come from states that like appreciate different approaches to the topic, because maybe you're a team like who wants to approach the topic, what are you affirming or negating from the left? Maybe you are from a state that enjoys non-traditional models of debate that don't always debate about the philosophical values of the resolution or like defend like policy statements. Or maybe you think that trying to defend retribution is unstrategic or morally inadvisable. Introducing criticisms or critiques. Critiques have become incredibly popular over the past few years and will be in no short abundance for this topic, particularly if you're debating in the Midwest or if you're debating in Texas, particularly at the TFA tournament. As a brief overview and introduction to like what critiques are fundamentally a criticism of the underlying assumptions that the 1EC makes. The 1EC in its construction of its case, whether it be its ethical framework, its research orientations, the contention or advantage grounds it makes underlying assumptions about how the world operates. This topic, the negative can and should be willing to exploit underlying assumptions that the 1EC implicitly makes that they are unwilling or unable to defend for their 1NCs. So if anybody has any questions about how critiques operate writ large, stay tuned as we will send more resources with sample cases and sample examples of like what critiques operate and how they can be explained in the future. And explanations of concepts can occur later in the email. Or if you have any questions, me and Chloe can stay after for the next 20 minutes after this lecture to answer any questions that you might have. So an overarching theme about critiques on this topic are like that link arguments are probably based on two things. One is that the frame of rehabilitation is bad, and two is that the justifications behind rehabilitation is bad. So I think the best link argument that you should be making on this topic is that every single criticism will have a criticism of the word or like the meaning of like or the assumptions behind rehabilitation. In order for something to be rehabilitated, rehabilitation requires that there needs to be something to be rehabilitated, or that there's something wrong that needs to be fixing, i.e., something that is wrong or something that needs further correcting. The basis for critiques on this topic will need to be a criticism of how the criminal justice system operates and how it has like punished, for example, people of color and like or like queer folks in particular, and have put them into positions that are like undesirable, and how its efforts to fix or redeem people is problematic for whatever reason that the criticism asserts. Second is that every single critique on this topic should have a criticism of why the app desires things like rehabilitation. There needs to be a purpose behind like why we decide to rehabilitate people, because otherwise the 1EC would just lose every single time, because they would lose the justification for why they decided to like read the 1EC out loud, or why they think rehabilitation is a good idea. So like maybe they think rehabilitation is bad because they recognize how retribution is, or like the current status quo is inherently a racist model of punishment, and that we ought to rectify that. Or the 1EC could be incredibly hard right, for example. It could argue that throwing people into prison costs way too much money. So therefore, it's more morally advisable to get people out of prisons because it costs too much to put them into prison to begin with. And you can obviously see like how like these two different justifications are inherently not the same thing. And like one of them probably can't be criticized, but then the other one probably could be criticized, which means that like critiques on this topic will probably have to hone in on both two things. The third thing I want to like go over before we go into like the like three different critiques on this topic is that critiques on this topic will be incredibly framework heavy because of the lack of like actual plain text and the lack of like of the ability to write a coherent plain text. I think, and like the idea and the fact that rehabilitation is the center and cornerstone behind like justifications for why we should do the affirmative plan or do the resolution, that the 1NC on the critique should be incredibly focused on arguing that the 1EC should be held to its foundational assumptions, and that the 1EC should justify those assumptions before anything else, because of the way that the resolution is worded, that it is a value statement. Disproving a core portion of that value statement probably negates. Does this mean that critiques actually negate the resolution on a truth level for once? Maybe. These are arguments that you will fundamentally have to make in the debate about what the role of negative rejoinder is in the context of like having to like respond to different affirmatives. So first, let's go over a few common critiques on this topic. I will get to messages in the chat later, but one thing that we will be going over this lecture is a brief overview of like what anti-Blackness criticisms can look like on this topic. The first criticism I want to go over is queer theory. So queer theory is something that has fallen out of the meta for quite possibly the longest time, but it's something that might actually return into the meta, and was especially a common occurrence in the criminal justice topic, and should definitely be a thing on this particular topic. So a quick thing about like queer theory writ large is that you should have like contextual examples for how the 1EC problematizes queer people. But first, you should probably explain the thesis of like what your criticism operates. So I think a key thing about queer theory writ large is that you need to argue specifically what queerness is and how it's marked in this relation to civil society. So an argument that like a lot of queer authors would make about queerness writ large is that queerness itself is deviancy, and it's marked by its relation to deviance. And like you should give like contextual examples about how that's the case. Like contextual examples about like, for example, queer people, like gay people, trans people, etc., and like their relationship to like the generic white heteronormative person within society, and how society seeks to exterminate deviancy, or how society seeks, or how society views queerness and views deviancy as something in a negative light that needs to be exterminated. There's two links that exist on queer theory that I think are somewhat viable. The first is the classic futurism bad link, and unfortunately, Lee Edelman cannot stop popping his head. Everybody who has run queer theory probably has like some background and some understanding of how the queer pessimism critique operates. I think the queer pessimism critique is honestly not the worst option for this topic, because there are genuine criticisms about how futurism operates and how like the idea of rehabilitation, and like the link is probably there. There is probably a reason, the justification behind rehabilitation probably has to do something about how like the future about potential futures, and like you should be, and like if you're a queer theory debater, you already know like the generic arguments that you can like potentially push when you're arguing about why futurism is something that is something that is bad. But unfortunately, this argument is probably not the most advisable for a couple key things. One, you are very susceptible to an impact turn, because it is probably the case that like queer pessimism is not the most academically supported literature base in all of history. And there's a debate meme that Lee Edelman is the most hated critical author, because everybody writes that Edelman does not know what they're saying, which means like if you decide to read a futurism bat, which means that like futurism bat links in a vacuum are probably not the best arguments that you should be making when it comes to like queer theory of negatives, or like queer theory criticisms on this topic. I think the critique that is probably the best when it comes to queer theory are things like is a criticism of the frame of rehabilitation. So the idea of rehabilitation is dependent on this idea of like the idea that somebody needs to be fixed, and like that can apply to things like deviant subjects. And I think a key affirmative that I think queer theory could exist versus, for example, or have a viable shot, or like affirmatives that deal with things like sex or drug offenders, or sex workers, for example, who many times are often queer and often are framed in a deviant manner. And how like, and like a lot of times these 1ECs and a lot of these 1ECs will make the argument that like these people do bad things, but they should be rehabilitated. A lot of 1Cs on this topic, especially if you're on the critical side of the perspective, should really push back on this idea that like these people need to be rehabilitated, or that there's something inherently wrong with being deviant, or that there's something wrong with like, for example, doing things like sex work that often queer people predominantly do a lot, or things like drug usage, which a lot of times queer youth are often susceptible to using drugs, which means like the frame of rehabilitation bad link is also definitely a link argument that you can definitely make on this topic that I think is more persuasive than like the generic futurism bad link that Edelman seems like always make on every single topic. And some authors that you can definitely research for this topic are obviously Lee Edelman, but I would suggest looking into other queer authors, for example, like Beidon or Lee Stanley in particular, and ungovernability, if you're trying to if you're trying to make a queer pessimism critique on this specific topic. The next topic, or the next critique I want to go over, is the Afro-pessimism critique. First, a quick thing about the Afro-pessimism critique. Please do not, overgeneralize anti-Blackness authors, and please do not assume that they argue the same thing. Anti-Blackness is a broad literature base, and you should not group Afro-pessimist literature base with the same literature base of like Moten and Harney, for example. Like you should not be reading Wilderson and Moten and Harney in the same 1C. That is probably a double turn, and there are multiple different reasons for why you should not generalize and homogenize Black literature. One is that this is probably unethical. There is like an incredible literature base about how Blackness operates, and there are different claims that are made by these different authors, which means that like you should not be trying to make contradictory claims. For example, you should not be reading a Moten link in the same 1C where you're claiming that we should be Afro-pessimists, because your own link author disagrees with Wilderson and disagrees with your own thesis, which means that you just double turned yourself. So like make sure that like whatever 1C that you're constructing on the topic does not double turn yourself, and actually has coherent authors that agree with each other about how the 1EC is an unethical project. The second thing is that this is also unstrategic for multiple reasons, as isolated above. If you will lose the debate at the end of the 1AR if you decide to put Moten and Harney and Wilderson into the same 1C. That is just asking yourself to get murked by somebody who in the 1AR who understands why Moten and Harney have a fundamentally different understanding about how Blackness operates than like Wilderson, which means that like you should not be reading them together into the same 1C. So I think a common link argument besides like there's often a lot of different Afro-pessimist link arguments that you can definitely make, like frame of rehabilitation is bad, or like the arc of redemption but being bad. But I think a really good link argument that like different tendencies on Afro-pessimism can make, regardless of whether or not you're an Afro-pessimist, a Black nihilist, or whether you're arguing the abolition critique or the racial capitalism critique, is the idea of liberalism being bad and the political being bad. I think that like in an argument about how reinvestments into the political as somehow a way to rectify anti-Blackness can be rhetorically violent or fully optimistic, can be an incredibly powerful critique, especially if you can give really good examples for why that's the case. Like you should be listing whenever you're debating, but particularly when you're reading any critique about anti-Blackness, you should probably be giving a lot of contextual examples for how like the political has failed, or why the structures of, like, for example, liberalism as a political ideology has failed at like has failed of like resolving anti-Blackness on a structural level, like giving broad examples for how liberalism as an ideal theory is incoherent, but also giving examples for how like things like police brutality and structural reinvest and like structural material efforts via government state action often fail at actually achieving any success for Black folk or people of color. And I think that like those often are like great links for like whatever criticism you're operating with. So like there's different obviously there are different anti-Blackness literature bases: Afro-pessimism, nihilism, racial cap, abolition, etc. But obviously do not read all four of these into the same one and see. You should not be reading abolition authors with Afro-pessimism authors. For example, if you're reading race war, for example, like if you're reading a race war critique, you should not be reading like Dylan Rodriguez in the same one and see with Frank Wilderson, because Dylan Rodriguez frankly hates Frank Wilderson and also disagrees with Frank Wilderson on a multiple different amount of issues. So like if you're ever reading criticisms, make sure your authors don't hate each other. Otherwise you're asking to just get more strategically. The third criticism before we move on to general questions will be the CAPK. I think the CAPK is incredibly underrated on this topic, but is actually a really good argument to be made. So the CAPK on this topic, first, you should have a thesis claim. You should have a reason why capitalism is bad. You cannot just assert that, ooh, the app what you see is capitalist, and then just say, oh, that's bad, but then not give a warrant or reason why. You can give a laundry list examples for why capitalism might be bad. If you're debating at TFA, you're probably just going to steal cards on the wiki that says capitalism causes extinction, because arguing that extinction does not outweigh is an uphill battle. But if you're deciding, but like if you're in like traditional settings, or like if you're in lay setting, or like you're in like more like flay settings where like you don't have to argue extinction level impacts, you can give a litany of like contextual examples for why capitalism is bad via things like inequality, sexism, etc. Like you should just like laundry list examples of how capitalism has like participated in like the necessary foundations of things like patriarchy, or things like racial inequality, how like it has necessitated things like where Black people are necessarily poorer and have to be kept at a lower hierarchy than like white people, and how capitalism is like at the intersection of these isms, and how that is like something that is inherently unethical. Those are definitely arguments that you can definitely be making if you don't want to go completely hard left and say capitalism leads to extinction. So I think there are two really good links when it comes to the capitalism critique. The first is the frame of rehab bad link. This is something that like you have seen is probably an overarching theme for every single criticism, but like whatever critique you have, you should probably have a link that says that the frame of rehabilitation is bad. And for this, you should say that the frame of rehabilitation is bad because of the purpose behind rehabilitation. So like the one ECs I talked about at like the top of this lecture deal with one ECs that talk about like productivity and deal with like why like it is better to have more productive members of society by reintegrating them rather than being punitive and punishing them. The issue with this is that this is probably capitalist in many different ways, and like reinvest in this idea that like people are only worth it, and we only reform the system because it is more productive to do so, which is something that you should be willing to defend, is something that is problematic, which gets back to framework arguments from the top of of the critique lecture, that you should be making arguments that like the 1EC has made assumptions about how productivity is a good thing, and how like we should sustain systems of insert thing that you're criticizing, because otherwise we are leading to unproductive citizens. You should say that the frame of unproductivity or productivity is something that is rhetorically violent and something that is capitalist, which shields you against the permutation and shields you and also gives you justification for why they don't get a permutation against your alternative that essentially fiats away capitalism. Which means that like if you're able to win that capitalism is bad and that you're able to win a strong framework and link push, then all you really need to do is win a riskable solvency, and then you're pretty much solid when it comes to like the cap K debate. When it comes to the alternative, I really dislike I really think that when it comes to alternatives for the CAPK, you should just be willing to defend extremely materialist alternatives. There is no reason why you should be defending alternatives that like just say think about something that magically leads to like the reform of capitalist structures, or like think about socialism, blah 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 blah. No, 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 no. I think when it comes to like these like hyper materialist critiques, you should be willing to take a mass stand about how to like resist capitalism as a broader structure, which means like the Escalante card that like a lot of kids from Texas read a lot is particularly good on this. The Escalante card often can like give a litany of examples for how like a post-communist revolution operates and how communism can succeed. Things like providing things like services to people, or like abandoning political systems is like an argument that the one and C should be willing to stake up, and like why we should divest from political systems and invest into things like revolution. This does two things for you. One, it actually solves for the link arguments that you have isolated above, and actually solves for the structures of how capitalism operates. But second is that also, if you're willing to defend divestment from the political system, you've also garnered yourself a meta theoretical justification to like abandon the perm, because the permutation probably has the sequence to stay in some instances, but your argument on either the link debate or the alternative debate will probably make an argument about how you can't divest, is about how like investment into the party probably requires divestment from state structures, which means that the permutation is nonsense, which is like an argument that you should also be making on framework, which means that like as long as you're winning that capitalism is bad and you're winning a link argument, you're probably guaranteed to like win these debates. Though winning capitalism is bad is probably an uphill battle in the truth sense, but like these are definitely arguments that you should definitely be willing to make. And that is the end of today's lecture. We are now open for CX. Feel free to like type any questions into the chat and we will be free to answer them. Chloe, I think this is a question for you. How do you answer a contractionism, a contract 1 and C?
Sure. So I think I haven't really done a lot of research on the offense on this topic. It seems like it might be straight refable, honestly, just thinking about it. I think honestly, and it also depends on what perspective you're looking at it from. Like, i.e., if you're looking at it from a utilitarian perspective, you can make arguments for why like being alive intrinsically outweighs, etc. I think that the contractarianism also very easily triggers permissibility if you're in a circuit round too, which I can talk more about, but yeah.
Question about the election CA. The election CA, honestly, the link debate about the election CA will be really interesting. I think that like you need to either win if you're affirmative in this topic. I think your best bet is to just straight turn the election CA. I think you should probably make arguments about how like Biden is not going to win the election right now, and how how criminal justice policy is actually popular. Though honestly, I think the election CA probably leans negative on this question. But like when it comes to like any politics CA or like the election CA, you should always have disciplined prep structures in which you have constant updated uniqueness, so you're not caught behind when the 1 and C just reads the election CA, so you have actual responses. You should also read defense in your 1ARs sometimes, especially if you're not sure that you can beat the 1 and C evidence on face, because if you straight turn the DA, then the 2NR probably does go for the DA, and if you realize that you're not winning the straight ref on the straight turn on the truth level, then you're kind of screwed in that context, which means like you should probably give the 2NR an out by just like conceding defense. Let's see here. Next question. Is it possible to run disability arguments? Disability argument. Oh, by the way, anybody who like wants to answer questions in the chat, feel free to do so. Disability arguments. I am not the most well versed about disability on this topic, so I honestly don't know how Malo or like other disability authors would like interact when it comes to criminal justice system. So like, I probably am not the best to answer this. Chloe, you have any takes on disability or no?
I don't know. There's probably some KAF ground, but I haven't really researched it. So yeah.
Lay 1 and C ground. Actually, I think for lay 1 and C ground, I think what Chloe discussed about Kant can definitely be turned into a lay 1 and C. Like, I think Kant can be something that is like can be like pretty easily explained to a lay judge, so long as like you're willing to like layify some language, and like we'll send like a lay version of the Kant 1 and C somewhere in the email chain. That should also answer Ryan's question. All right. I'll group the CapK questions together. When it comes to the CapK questions together, I think the way that you should set up the ult to answer the permutation is that you should probably be willing to defend a massive materialist alternative that necessitates rejection of the affirmative. Like the best way to like meta theoretically protect yourself from the permutation is like a massive alternative that is willing to defend the impact trend, that is willing to say, look, we think capitalism is bad, we think state investment is bad, we think that anything that isn't like investment into the party line is bad. It's like that the Escalante alternative or like the Shea card that like the bread kids read is something that is definitely a viable option for the true and art, because like those alternatives have something that like meta theoretically justify why the permutation is complete nonsense or like theoretically incoherent. When it comes to cap case solvency corrections, let's see. Could you play solvency? Yeah, cap case solvency. When it comes to solvency, the Escalante card that like a lot of kids read explains this really well. It talks about like it makes like a broader theoretical claim about how like materialism controls the root cause for like how we think about the world, which means like if we meet people's materialist needs, that therefore means that like they won't be capitalist anymore. That is probably false for like multiple different reasons, but for some reason the one art does not know the answer to this. So like, let's see here. For trad debater, what are the best? For trad debaters, when it comes to best, unique, and affinic arguments, I think that like I would recommend arguments that like have like that like negate like the general principle or firm general principles behind the resolution. For example, I think Kant is like the best late NC, not gonna lie, because I think that like it gives a meta theoretical justification for why we should like reject all forms of like rehabilitation and why we should believe in retributionism as like just a general model of ethics and like a general model of punishment wherever we go, which means like if you win Kant, then like that becomes like an easy slam dunk for the negative. When it comes to unique arguments on this ground, I'm not gonna lie, I think that like the issue with like unique ground when it comes to like traditional settings is that traditional settings often have judges that are like incredibly hostile to like things that are like outside the norm. What are good CPs do you think are coming out for this topic? I honestly have not done ground on counterplans, because also another thing is like I have not actually done any research about like how counterplans might operate on this topic. Like maybe they're like, what is like another model? Restitution. Restitution might be a counterpoint on this topic randomly, but like I think restitution is probably a bad model of like about criminal justice as well, because poor people can't pay restitution. Chloe, what are your takes on counterplans?
Um, I don't know. I don't think that process counterplans. I think that a lot of counterplans don't negate on this topic. And I also saw a question about consequentialism versus non-consequentialism. Um, so I'll just answer it. We're actually, Will, did you have anything else to say on counterplans, or can I answer
Nah,
it?
I don't have anything to say on counterplans. I don't think counterplans actually like negate, not gonna lie, in this
Yeah, I don't
topic.
think so either. So consequentialism basically says that the consequences of an action should determine if it's ethical or unethical, whereas non-consequentialism, usually deontology, would say that the intent of an action itself or other intrinsic factors would matter more, or would and not the consequences. For example, utilitarianism would be a consequentialist framework because it says if more people are happy, or more it increases dopamine or fitness or whatever, then that would mean that it's good. If it decreases it, then it's bad, which is reliant on consequences. But something like Kant would intrinsically say that something like the categorical imperative is good, even though that's not consequence based.
Let's see here. Rawls theory of justice. Chloe, what are your takes on Rawls?
I think Rawls would probably, again, I haven't done a lot of topic research, but I think it would probably affirm, um, because of the veil of ignorance and such, it would probably be better to not punish people. But again, I haven't done any topic research on that, so I can
I think
get back to you on this later.
I mostly agree with Chloe on this. I think Rawls is like very susceptible. I think Rawls is like something that's like intuitive, but I also think it's something that's like receptible to like the straight turn, or like the straight ref. Honestly, I low-key do agree with Andrew though. Read util if you're I think there's no strategic benefit to Rawls. I think Rawls is like inherently consequentialist, and also I don't understand like how Rawls can like just like how like we would like use the veil to like come to ethical conclusions, because we also have different, because like you can't use the veil once you like once like you're in the physical like world, because like you have like different conceptions of like what you want like the rest of us to experience, which means like I don't think like Rawls has like too much of a strategic benefit, even if it's like something that like is like intuitive. Let's see here. Uh, Talha. Chloe, can you re-explain Kant to Talha when it comes to like different arguments?
Oh yeah, definitely. What was the question exactly?
Can you explain Kant to me for someone who has never heard of it, and also
Oh yeah,
answer Kant?
of course. So basically, I think the starting point of morality is practical reason, or your ability to be able to reason, which comes prior to everything because it's a prerequisite to being able to experience the world. And we would say that things like pleasure or pain are reliant on things that are not intrinsic. For example, if you have a different conception of what's pleasurable than someone else, if you like pizza but someone else doesn't like pizza, then that means that the ethics of pleasure and pain are not binding. Whereas reason or rationality is binding because everyone intrinsically has it. We say that that is we say that that's binding and that ethics need to be universal, because if ethics are not universal, i.e. pleasure and pain, then that would mean that it fails to guide action. And a priori principles like reason definitionally apply to everyone, such as 2 + 2 = 4 applies to everyone. Then it needs to be non-contradictory, because anything else would justify other people being able to impede on your ends, which would just be a contradiction in conception, which would mean that we're able to sort of impede on other people's ends, which would just create massive issues in the world. And basically, another important argument is performativity. In order to justify our own arguments, we need to assume that we're free within the world and within the round as well. And consequences fail is not an intrinsic part of the framework, but it's just a thing that takes out a lot of consequentialist frameworks, such as utilitarianism, which rely on consequences, whereas Kant relies more on intent-based theories. And yeah, that should be it. Let me know. That was probably just a recap of what I said before, but if there's anything more specific that you're confused about, I can explain it.
I think that is all we have time for questions for today. Thank you all for coming to today's lecture. Pause share. Let me pause share. Stop share.
Oh, also, if anyone was confused about the consequentialism fail stuff, feel free to message me afterwards.
We will also like forward all y'all speech documents and like all the evidence stuff in the email chain. Have a good day, y'all.